In the Reformed groups, the major doctrinal issue during this time had to do with the teachings of a man named Jacob Arminius. Jacob Arminius was born to well-to-do Dutch parents, so grew up in Holland, had studied in Geneva, and actually had studied with one of Calvin's most prominent students, a man named Theodore Beza, and so was well acquainted with Calvin's teaching, and became a Reformed preacher in Amsterdam. At one point, he is called upon to challenge a theologian who is rejecting some of Calvin's teachings. And so as he's preparing for this, he actually becomes convinced that his opponent's teachings are correct. Right? So he's kind of called upon to defend the Calvin Reformed model and ends up thinking the other side is right. Particularly problematic for Arminius was the issue of predestination and election. He would adopt an idea that was very similar to the Catholic position, that God did predestine, but he predestined those he knew would have faith. Right? So, which was different from the Calvin position. The Calvin position was God had chosen people to be saved and people to be lost, solely on God's sovereign choice, not because of what they might do in the future. Arminius, however, was saying God looks into the future before creation, and he knows who's going to follow him, who's going to not, who's going to have faith, who's going to not, and then thus predestine those people to have faith or to be lost. Predestination also, for him, becomes very similar to the Anabaptist position, where predestination is more about God predestining Jesus as the Redeemer rather than the individual salvation or damnation of a person. In other ways, he remains very, very Calvinistic, but it's predestined and election where it becomes the problem positions. Arminius dies in 1609, but others kind of take up his teachings and continue to promote them. They're particularly focused on 5 issues. The issue of predestination, and particularly Arminius, although he's beginning to question the Calvinist position, says that there's just so much we don't know. It shouldn't be about speculating about predestination so much. A second thing that these Arminians are, not Armenians from Armenia, Arminians, these Armenians are saying is that Jesus died for all human beings. All right, the second, third generation of Calvinists are saying Christ's death only is valid for the elect. So it's only certain people that receive the benefits, it's only certain people that are under the sacrifice of Jesus. The Arminians were saying Jesus' death was for all human beings, but it's only effective for believers. And so only those people that are going to believe are going to receive those benefits. A third point where they would have been very similar to the Calvinist position was that God's grace was wholly necessary for salvation. It was wholly necessary for humans to do anything good. Right? So they're not saying human beings can bring about their own salvation. Right? So they would have agreed with Calvin on this position. A fourth point that they emphasized was that grace was resistible. Part of the process of your election being evidenced was that God would give you grace, and that grace would be irresistible for the Calvinists. There is nothing you could do to resist God's grace. Then our Arminians said, no, God's grace is resistible. You'd be stupid to resist it, right? But you could resist it. And finally, they could not commit to the idea of the perseverance of the saints, or sometimes referred to as once saved, always saved. They believed that there was the possibility for a person to lose their salvation through their own choices, not because salvation was somehow ineffective. So as these things are going on in Holland, there is a rupture occurring in Reformed circles between the Dutch Calvinist party and the Arminian party. So the Synod of Dort was called, Dort, a city there in Holland. And so the Synod, a gathering of a variety of religious leaders, ministers, and others, called to address this growing divide between the Arminians and the Calvinists. The Synod was largely shaped by Calvinist interests. The Arminian party was not very well represented there, and Calvinist, Reformed Christians and theologians throughout Europe were called to attend to the Synod, and many did. Ultimately, the Synod resulted in the condemnation of Arminianism and supporting Calvinism. Now, particularly out of the Synod of Dort, you'd have what are the so-called 5 points of Calvinism. Often these are assumed to be from Calvin. Some of them are. Calvin emphasized some of these things. Others, Calvin didn't emphasize so much. But they are known by the acronym TULIP. TULIP stands for total depravity. I mean, there's nothing good in human beings, which Calvin didn't completely support. Unconditional election. This is the idea that God chose people without, knowing who's going to have faith, who's going to not. Right? He chose on his own. Limited atonement. Limited atonement refers to the idea that Jesus' blood, Jesus' death, was only for the elect. It was not. Jesus didn't die for everybody. It was only for the elect. The I stands for irresistible grace, meaning that if God has chosen you, grace will change you. It will change your nature. You can't stop. And then perseverance of the saints, or the so-called once saved, always saved. Arminians were ordered to pay fines by the Synod. Several of them were imprisoned or sentenced to death. Many of them fled from Holland. And Arminianism did not die out. When we get to the 18th century, we'll see how some groups like the Methodists are heavily influenced by this Arminian outlook. Any questions about Arminianism? In a very brief overview. So while Arminianism is kind of developing and running into problems, in England there is a very strong statement of Calvinism that becomes very important, known as the Westminster Confession of Faith. During the English Civil War, Parliament decides to convene a body of theologians from both England and Scotland. And the goal of this assembly, known as the Westminster Assembly, is to address a variety of issues, theological issues, what form of government the church should take. Ultimately, the Westminster Assembly encouraged the adoption of a Presbyterian form of government. We didn't really talk about it too much, but Presbyterianism developed in Scotland during the Reformation. And instead of having the bishop model, like the Anglican Church, the Presbyterians were governed by groups of elders. So each church had a body of elders, coming from the Greek term for elder, presbyteros. So presbytery kind of comes from that. So you would have a body of elders governing a local church, and then there would be a regional body of elders governing several churches. And then there would be a synod, which is a group of regional bodies, and then the General Assembly, which was over the synod. So essentially you have a national church in Scotland without the bishops. And so there's still that kind of denominational structure in there. Largely it had been accepted in Scotland, and it ends up being accepted by Parliament due to the power of the Scottish Army needed for the Civil War. Eventually, of course, as the monarchy is restored, it will go back to an Anglican form of government. We also talked about the congregational form of government of the Puritans. One of the things produced by the Westminster Assembly was the Westminster Confession. And a lot of the themes that were expressed in the Confession were themes expressed in other Reformed documents, especially the Calvinist documents. One was the emphasis on God's absolute sovereignty. God is majestic. God is powerful. God is wholly other and unknowable. Or you might have heard the term inscrutable. Right? And so they really want to make a distinction and some distance between God and human beings. And so God is separate and apart, holy, king. Also important for the Westminster Assembly and the Confession of Faith was the depravity of human beings. There was nothing good about human beings in their nature, which means God must transform human beings so that they can be saved. They also supported the idea of double predestination. God explicitly chooses who would be saved, who would be lost. And so very Calvinist outlook. Also very important for the Westminster Assembly was God's revealed law. So very focused on kind of a legal approach to the Bible, which was also very Calvinist. The law of the Old Testament and the New Testament guided church practice. They supported very strict Sabbath regulations, very strict approaches to personal behavior. And it also really revived the Old Testament and the importance of the Old Testament. Using Old Testament heroes to talk to children, using the example of Israel for government. And so the Old Testament becoming very important. There were other things in the Westminster Confession of Faith, all sorts of things that are important for a variety of other things. They encouraged the idea of using the Bible to interpret the Bible. Maybe you've heard that before. And so if you're looking at an issue, if you're trying to determine what the Bible teaches about something, you use clear passages to help you understand the less clear ones. Well, that was one of the things that they were encouraged out of Westminster. So, in thinking about Reformed tradition, we talked about Arminianism being very important, Westminster Confession of Faith, also very important, especially from the Puritan strand of the Reformed mind, was the concept of covenants. God had engaged in 3 covenants with human beings related to salvation. The first was a covenant of works. And this was a covenant between God and Adam. If Adam did certain things, he would inherit eternal life. Of course, if he didn't do certain things, he wouldn't. Right? So the idea was, before the fall, God told Adam, do these things and you will inherit eternal life. But of course, Adam failed. And because of Adam's failure, in the Reformed mindset, sin was passed to all human beings. And so we could not do enough good things. So the covenant of works died with Adam and Adam's sin. The covenant of grace was between God and Abraham. And the covenant of grace was enacted upon Abraham being the friend of God. Human responsibility in this covenant was for faith. God saves those who believe, even provides the power of belief. The third covenant, the one for, especially important for the 17th century, was the covenant of redemption. God and Christ had covenanted together for Christ to serve as a sacrifice. Right? And so the covenant of redemption was between God and Christ. This covenant mindset became very, very important for the Puritans, as I mentioned already. Puritans covenanted together, that's a tough word to say, to form government. Right? And so as the Puritans settled in Massachusetts Bay, they all agreed to this covenant of how the society would be run. They covenanted together to form a church. And so there's all this kind of reciprocal responsibilities between individuals. Society then was largely made up of, in their mindset, what were known as visible saints. Now, the Puritan mindset, very influenced by Calvinism. So there's the elect, there's the damned. But everybody should at least look like they're the elect. So outwardly, by following the laws of society, even if you weren't saved by God, you would at least look that way. And so a society, a commonwealth of visible saints was very important to them. But not everyone who was a part of Puritan society was also a member of the church. Right? So you covenanted together to make a society, but there were special restrictions in Puritan thinking about who was a part of the church. People were expected to attend church, obviously, and parents were expected to baptize their infants. But to be a church member, one must have had a conversion experience that evidenced they possessed saving faith. Right? So you would be baptized as an infant, and it was expected that early adulthood you would have some sort of experience that you would then relate to the congregation, and they would vote to accept you or not. A lot of the Puritan conversion narratives, many of which have survived because Puritans recorded just about everything, often tend to be very formulaic. Because the expectation was that once you had this experience, you would then present it to the congregation. Now, if you were female, you presented it to the minister, and the minister would then, during in services, offer the conversion narrative. So kind of the first stage was this conviction of being under sin. Right? That at some point you would start to feel yourself very spiritually agitated. You'd feel this kind of humiliation in your soul. It would just kind of come upon you at night. And then eventually you would recognize, either just through reflection or through actually trying to do good works, you'd recognize that good works were not going to help this spiritual agitation. And so you began to feel despair. Because you have no hope. And at the bottom of this pit of despair, that was quite common in these conversion narratives, you would begin to understand God's grace. You would kind of have this experience, this overwhelmingness, this appreciation of God's grace. And then eventually you would start to reflect obedience in your life because of how you understood God's grace. The good could never entirely be sure of their election. But your life should exhibit it through your works. And so that's basically how the stories went, right? I was walking through the woods and I really kind of started to feel agitated in my soul, and I started to recognize how sinful I was. And over the next several weeks I tried to do a lot of good things to, kind of feel better, and it just didn't help. And finally I began to understand God is a graceful God, and my good works are not sufficient, and that brought a peace and a calming over my soul. So something like that. And then the rest of the congregation would vote on whether you had an experience and whether you should be accepted as a full member of the church. This was important because only full members of the church could vote in elections. Right? So you could only participate in certain aspects of the church, but were only allowed to vote in political events as well. So there were some things that members of the church had, some privileges and rights that other people did not have. By the middle of the 1600s, though, some things started to fall apart in New England. Puritan church membership was declining. Now that early generation, that generation of the 1630 Massachusetts Bay, they're coming over here, there's errand into the wilderness, there's this Israel escaping in the Exodus. They're so unattainable Right? They've held them so far in their minds that they just can't live up to them. And so people weren't having those experiences, weren't having those conversion experiences. Now, because of that, they were kept from participating in communion, because you could only participate in communion as a full church member. It's what we might call a closed communion. And communion was only offered to those that were full church members. And that also meant that your children would not be allowed to be baptized. So there's kind of concern for your own soul as well as the generation after you. And it becomes especially concerning as this third generation is being brought up. They can't be baptized because their parents aren't church members. And so several Puritan theologians developed what became known as the halfway covenant. It's very much a response to this crisis of Puritan membership. It would be a way to keep the second generation connected to the church because that second generation, even though they're not having their conversion experiences, wanted their children to be baptized. And so they would also keep that third generation. Now, the second generation had been baptized its children, so they were halfway in the covenant. They'd been baptized, but they hadn't had the conversion experience. So it was decided their children could be baptized. They could not take the Lord's Supper still. They could not vote on church membership, but their children could still be baptized, with the hope that at some point they're going to have a conversion experience and their children are going to have the conversion experience. Not everybody, not all the Puritans thought this was the appropriate response. And so you have some who say, okay, this is a good idea, others that say it's not. Even later, it was extended to allow the children of unbaptized adults to be baptized. And so it's eventually becomes very, very broad to try and keep people connected to the church.